kind of open it up, afterwards to save some time. And I tend to talk pretty quickly, and my slides are fairly visual. So let me just, so what do I have to do? I would have to share my screen, right?
Yeah, so I just made you a co-host.
Okay, so
and that should allow you to have the share screen function.
This should work.
And I'm also going to spotlight you.
Yes, can see it.
There you go. Okay, so play from start. Great. So yes, I'm Diana, and I'm a clinical psychologist who co-founded GenderDynamix, which is a charitable nonprofit in the Bay of Plenty, meeting the mild to moderate mental health needs of the gender diverse community. So I love this whole idea and bringing, more different kinds of expression and working together and collaborating and with dance. Dance is something that I always have loved, and this whole project sounds really interesting to me. However, having said that, I want to profess absolutely very minimal knowledge of the Zouk community, and that this presentation was really just to kind of start to talk about things that and answer any questions that people might have. So gender diversity has literally occurred across time, species, and culture. Historically, around a similar percentage of creatures have exhibited gender diverse qualities, roughly, depending upon your statistics, anywhere from 2 to 5% of populations. These are some of the words that are used in different Pacifica communities. And before colonization, Maori were very kind of sexually and gender fluid. And the term that is kind of being recaptured is a takatapui here in New Zealand. Just to put things in kind of Western perspective, Magnus Hirschfeld Magnus Hirschfeld and Harry Benjamin were both German. Magnus Hirschfeld was a sexologist, and Harry Benjamin was an endocrinologist. Magnus Hirschfeld was gay and targeted by the Nazis and put together a tremendous body of research in Berlin. If you think of kind of the sexual revolution with can-can dancers and stuff in Paris, similar thing was going on in Berlin. But then all of his work was destroyed by the Nazis. And Harry Benjamin came to the US and was one of the first people who was actually prescribing hormones and working with gender diverse people. These are just some pioneering big names, and Lily Elbe was the Danish girl, was written about her. She had multiple surgeries, and it was actually one of the surgeries was performed by Magnus Hirschfeld. And did eventually die as a result of complications from a fourth surgery. Christine Jorgensen was very well known in the US, a lot of media attention as the G.I. Joe turned G.I. Jane kind of stereotype. And then Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were two activists that actually were at Stonewall. If anyone's familiar with the current, Pride marches, it kind of stems from the history of Stonewall, what happened just over 50 years ago. Some notable transmasculine and gender fluid individuals. Billy Tipton was a jazz musician that nobody, well, from most accounts, people didn't realize had been born female-bodied until after his death. Leslie Feinberg has written a number of books and is just a brilliant writer. Wrote Stone Butch Blues, is one of the more famous ones, and lived kind of in various gender identities throughout their lifespan. I think that one of the reasons we're having this conversation because there has been a recent rise in transmedia exposure. Laverne Cox, Transgender Tipping Point, Avery Jackson, more and more youth presentations, Elliot Page. We're seeing it more in all kinds of media as it's and it is a lot of people that I work with. Having these representations have enabled them to feel more comfortable and normalized and find words for their experiences, which has been really helpful. But of course, not all media representations are accurate or helpful. Oops, wrong direction. some New Zealand things. Felicia Brown Acton has been, a member of the Takatapui community here in New Zealand and won a bunch of awards, doing fantastic work. Georgina Bayer, a trans woman, a sex worker, member of parliament, one of the first in the world. And Ruangi was a feature made here in New Zealand written by, starring, and worked on with gender diverse people here in New Zealand. So I just want to talk really briefly as a one-on-one, the difference between sex, sexuality, and gender. So sex are like biological reproductive characteristics. We like to, people tend to think of gender on a very binary model, and what I work in this space for a really long time, and it's very much a learned experience if you break it down. So, there are multiple people who are intersex, multiple variations of sex that are much more common than a lot of people realize. Sexuality is somebody's, attraction to somebody, or a group of people. And then gender is, your lived experience of self, right? If you were to look at gender expression and how gender expression has changed over the years, a few hundred years in Europe, people who were gendered as male were wearing high heels and wigs and powder and lace, and this kind of, does go with social things over back and forth in almost a tidal way. So just to really kind of separate these as very separate things. Very quickly, gender identity is about, the inherent sense of self. It's not a choice. It's more like, am I right-handed or am I left-handed? This is more of an umbrella term. Irifiti is a Maori word. Non-binary is somebody that non-binary typically falls under the transgender umbrella, but it's someone who doesn't identify particularly with one gender or a binary situation on the other. And that can be both stable non-binary or more of a fluid presentation where you're feeling like more inclined or identified in one way or another at different periods. Intersex, medical term, and interestingly, a huge number of people that would qualify from, just a kind of, there's no such thing as normal, there's only average. So there's average and there's outside of average. Huge number of people would qualify for intersex status that don't even know about it. Pronouns. This is something that I do want to impress upon anybody watching this. It's a natural part of language and grammar, but it's incredibly important in how we refer to people. I'm aware that a lot of why I hear that, and I've personally experienced, sometimes using gender neutral pronouns, they, them, can feel a little awkward, but it's not grammatically incorrect. Shakespeare was using, the neutral pronouns in the singular. And if you start to use neutral pronouns, it becomes increasingly comfortable. And some of the things that I often find myself doing is if I'm not sure of somebody's gender identity, I will use either gender neutral pronouns or I'll use the person's name and I will ask them. But pronouns are incredibly important to be aware of because they can be used in a very gender affirming way. And they can also be, I've seen them used as a weapon. Misgendering, intentionally or unintentionally. I know that a lot of people feel anxious about misgendering or potentially misgendering. And, if that does happen, then the thing to do is to kind of acknowledge it, change it, and move on, not to go into a huge issue of explaining and, this and making a big deal of it. It's just, notice it, correct yourself, and keep it moving. Authentic name. Asking people, just a thing of respect. What do you like to be called? Dead naming, incorrect naming. I don't think that we'll have a lot of problems with this particular workshop because I think everyone will, be registered as their authentic self. These are just kind of medical terms that you would use about, assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, male to female, female to male. Sometimes in just to clarify in discussion. Transitions, transitions, the three main forms of transition are medical, social, or legal, and none of these are required in any way for someone's gender identity to be, inherent, felt, perceived, and affirmed. This is hormones for medical transition. It used to be more HRT, hormone replacement. Now it's GAT, gender affirming hormone treatment. Come on. There we go. Dysphoria, these are gender dysphoria, just to kind of give a little bit of context that historically the way that transgender people have been treated in the medical system, before, about 10 years ago, the diagnosis was gender identity disorder, which then they changed to gender dysphoria, as it is much less stigmatizing and much more inclusive. And now that's been updated in one of the newer diagnostic models to gender incongruence, which simply means that your assigned gender does not align with your identified gender. And instead of being a mental health condition, they're taking it out of mental health and placing it into sexual health, where most people receive treatment. So it's a significantly less stigmatizing classification and increasingly moving towards that way. I really like this kind of way of thinking about it because, asking somebody, how they identify, I wish that I could have a globe, a sphere, rather than, definitely not a binary model. This is a little bit more inclusive, because the opposite of being male is not female. The opposite of being male is being not male. So, just that's what I love about the Zouk thing, especially the switching. When, you can ask, what is the role that you're playing today? What are you looking for? It seems like there's a lot of consent and a lot of communication and a lot of flexibility. Just to put it in perspective, gender diverse people experience a tremendous amount of minority stress, much more than mainstream, their mainstream cisgender counterparts. Intersectionality really has to do in individual presentations. So, there's no way that we can touch on all of this, but recognizing that this population has as poor outcomes kind of almost universally, unless they have, affirming environments. With affirming environments, gender diverse people have the same kind of outcomes as their mainstream cisgendered peers. So what's interesting for me as someone who works in this space quite a lot, that I'm constantly learning and about myself and my own biases and other people's, to what I think Zouk is very interesting is because we're so biased in our partner dancing as being typically male and female, to kind of flip that on its head. And what I really love about the idea of, making this available to the gender diverse population is, it was a partner dancing in a vulnerable population being asked to, participate in something that might be triggering, or they might have, difficult history with, and that, as clinicians or dance teachers or dance partners, we just might not be aware of how some things are particularly sensitive or triggering. I just think it's interesting if we can take a moment to think about, the various identities that we all possess, because we all have privilege. And, the LGBT community, but particularly the trans community, is treated very differently in many ways and in many environments. So I think that when we're working with that, we should, especially in this environment that we want to be so safe and so inclusive, to be aware. Was someone going to say something? Did I hear? Comment? Sorry, thought I did. Just thinking about cisgender privilege, bathrooms, assumptions. And passing is very controversial, because some people passing is important. Some people passing is not as important. Some people passing is a privilege. Some people don't have that privilege. And I think from the videos that I've watched with Zouk, it's really, I love that that's not, that the playfulness of it, of the back and forth with the switching is just lovely.
Sorry, can you just explain passing?
Oh, passing is a term meaning that you would be identified as your, so there's transgender, right? So that's trans separate from their assigned gender. Cisgender, somebody who my pronouns are she, her. I was identified as female at birth. I identify as a female. So cis meaning kind of together. And passing is something that would be if you are gender diverse and you are passing, you would be identified by strangers as your gender, your identified gender. And some people, you know, actually there's another word called stealth, which means actually passing to the point that you have a whole identity that you are not gender diverse at all. You are, you know, you're clearly accepted as your true gender, but it does require, it can require, you know, a backstory and some maintenance and some complexity. So passing is very important to some people. Sometimes it's literally a life and death safety thing, and passing is not as important to others, or not possible for others. It's a controversial thing within the community. Gender diversity across time. So this is when we're looking at the spectrum of biological sex. So much is, it's really when you look at it, how much is determined by our genitalia. When people find themselves pregnant, so often it's like, what are you having? I mean, one would hope the one's having a healthy child, but it's really determined by, you know, what the genitalia between the legs. But here's all of the different ways that gender can be expressed, or some of the different ways. And if you can see, all of them are literally on a spectrum. I also think that this is really important to stress that, so we have our sex, our biological sex, our gender identity, how we identify and who we are, our sexual orientation, who we love or who we find ourselves attracted to or want to be romantically or sexually linked to, and then gender expression, how we express that. And so, you know, gender identity and gender expression can sometimes be aligned in what we would think would be stereotypical ways, and then others, you know, not at all. And that is completely acceptable. And I think that that's one of the things that Zouk brings in, that there's no expectation of gender expression, because we are and kind of pushing against some of these biases that we have. So, you know, just in the environment, and especially in a dance room where people are going to be, you know, sharing movement and sharing expression and plus sharing touch, we just want to make sure that language is respectful, pronouns, effort, you know, that really it's impossible to ever please everyone. Unfortunately, when we have group situations, there's someone who may interpret something in a way that may not be how it was intended. However, if you don't know, really ask respectfully. You know, every person that I've met, that I work with, if you are, you know, coming with kindness and curiosity and put some effort into it, then that's what people are responding to and reacting to. Bathroom signage, names and pronouns. I just, you know, in introductions, if you're going to do a workshop, I think that would be important to start with, you know, kind of names and pronouns, just as respectfully, what would you like to be called? You know, and there's take cues, different people, there's a lot of different language and terminology, and different people prefer different language and terminology, and language is constantly evolving. I think that it's always a good idea to take cues when you're doing an introduction, how people refer to themselves, and you try and mirror that and reflect that back to them, which almost, I think, sets the stage for then movements to come in. You know, you're creating a container with language and shared communication before you move into the movement. And, you know, subtle visual cues, like if this were not to be specifically a workshop, you know, incorporating, you know, for the gender diverse population, and just a workshop where everyone is welcome, and we want to subtly acknowledge the LGBT community, different little things that most people wouldn't pick up somebody will, like, you know, a little pride flag in the corner, or, you know, some sort of acknowledgement somehow, showing them that it's a safe space. We already talked about these. This is kind of more for the diagnostic stuff with the doctors and nurses. And this is a different kind of way of looking at the visual representation of different ways that people might identify or might experience their gender. A lot of people, when I'm working with them, will come into me and say, you know, hey, this is how I'm feeling, and it's something to be explored, or I'm not sure how I'm feeling. And I would ask, you know, well, if you were to think for a moment and reflect, where might you be feeling or identifying at this point today? Because we could change, and just so that we have, you know, some shared language. And I'm just showing it to you so that you can see that there's such a spectrum of ways, and that a lot of people tend to think of the binary system. I think of it really as like flat Earth. You know, if I lived a long time ago, I would believe that the Earth was flat, because that, I'm sure, was how it would be perceived to me until we got better science. And the whole idea of like just this gender binary is very much a flat Earth thing. We have like much better science and much richer information. This is just a brief summary of statistics. There was the Counting Ourselves survey was done in 2018 and has now been redone recently. The results aren't out yet, but this is the largest body of data on the transgender non-binary population within New Zealand. So more and more research is being done, more and more resources are being allocated, but it is still quite, it can be controversial, somehow ends up being political. This is something that can be very confrontive to a lot of people. Just to touch on non-binary identities, in my work with people who have not a whole lot of experience with gender diverse populations, there seems to be increasing understanding of of like an idea, was a weird stereotype. Oh, so you're in the wrong body, which is, you know, a stereotype, and definitely not true for everybody. But increasing numbers of people are identifying as non-binary. So there's still the minority population, but the fastest growing population, and particularly with young people, younger people. And one of the things, what I see, and this is just me speaking from, you know, my clinical perspective, it's not a research topic, is that we tend to see people primarily through the lens of gender. It's one of the first things that we notice or we assume about someone. And once we've made that assumption, then a number of assumptions follow. And with, you know, I think that of course, there are lots of people who just that doesn't work for them, that they're identified, they don't identify with either male or female. There's also a lot of people who just don't want to be identified primarily through that gendered lens, that they want to be identified for other attributes that are, you know, equally representative of who they are. And I think that can be incorporated in dance and arts and expression in a really beautiful way. Just, you know, quickly, when we talk about transition, nobody requires any amount of transition for their gender identity to be valid. But, you know, transitions tend to be social transitions, which are the way that, you know, you names, pronouns, how you hair, makeup, you know, outward presentation. Medical transition would be looking at, you know, working with a specialist for anything from hormones to surgery, depending upon the individual's, you know, particular needs. Legal transition would be more like legal name change, legal gender change. But none of this is required and should not be assumed. And it's kind of impolite to ask. You know, there's a lot of like trans people often find themselves like this unfortunate or unasked for blank slate for other people's projections, or they almost have to kind of justify and defend things that you know, a lot of other people do not, and frankly would find offensive, because there's a lot of very strange assumptions or around it. I just like to, you know, end with the golden rule, right? We treat everyone like you want to be treated, which is a lovely idea, but I'm all about the platinum rule. try to treat others like they want to be treated. And that's about, you know, as I said, kindness, curiosity, asking, playing, and that, you know, people who want to be allies, that it's important. I like visuals. This makes sense to me, that, you know, trying to figure out where's my role? Am I going to work alongside someone in front or behind? Am I leading? Am I following? So thanks for that. Any questions, comments? Is this a good place to start a conversation?
Yeah, awesome. There was a slide back a bit where you had some suggestions. You were talking about asking for pronouns and stuff. Maybe could we go back to that, because that seemed like it had some really practical ideas.
Sure, let me find it. Really just is, I think it's this one. Sorry, let me go where, what happened? I need to share my screen. There we go. This, yeah, just making sure, you know, I think on your registration form was fairly inclusive. It was, you know, just putting your name on, but, you know, as I said, I think it would be a good idea to incorporate names, pronouns, or, you know, how would you like to be called? I don't know if in the Zouk thing, I was looking at the Facebook things that you sent. You said that there was some sort of process where people identify if they'd like to be leading or following or switching, or what they're looking for. Is that something that is like stated when at the introduction? I mean, how would people know that in the dance workshop?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Sometimes it's just assumed, to be fair, and not all forms allow for switches. So there's plenty of times that you have to choose which role you're going to dance in before you turn up. And that can be problematic if you like to maybe switch at the end of the day, for example. That's a lot of brain work to lead. So maybe by the end of the day, you're wanting to follow, and that can be really hard. If you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my suggestion would be to, you know, if you wanted to, in this particular workshop, try actually stating that and discussing that and agreeing upon that and having consent for that, so that everybody is comfortable and you know, is more, because especially with this workshop, you know, you're going to be attracting participants who are not necessarily part of the dance community and have maybe either felt like who were previously in the dance community and then felt kind of excluded as a result of their gender transition, or have never been a dancer, and, you know, movement might be very foreign to them, and this might be pushing their own boundaries about in that area. So, I mean, I don't know what the normal protocol would be in a workshop, and obviously, you know, I don't have any real understanding of what would be appropriate.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the normal, and it does depend on the teachers at the time, because often there's very binary language. So they will talk about ladies and men, and they'll say ladies on one side, men on the other. And sometimes they will use the terms lead and follow. But then they will say your lead's going to do this and he's going to put his hand here. And so it does, the language is quite, can often be very gendered, but that's the teachers in the schools themselves that are presenting at the time. And it doesn't mean that they're exclusive, because most of the people using that language can switch, can dance and lead and follow, and allow, you know, there will be people switches in the class. But the language is still quite loaded. And that's one of the things that I would love to just kind of bring, that's part of this conversation. I want to bring that to the forefront, so that it's okay to refer to a lead as they. Like when you're talking about leads over this side, and your lead is going to put their hand here because we don't know. And if we can just be more I mean, if I could just if I could just have one thing, it would be for they to become much more commonly used, just in general.
And it just takes some practice. I mean, like anything, if you were to go home and brush your teeth with the other hand that you normally use, it would feel very strange. But if you did it for a week, it would be perfectly natural. Yeah. So then splitting it to, you know, here people who would like to lead and people who would like to follow, or, you know, and they will put their hand, and if you start to incorporate this in your day-to-day language, then it becomes much more natural. And is respectful. Because I would imagine, I mean, it's a lovely, I love the whole idea, of course, in anything that I can bring to, you know, the people that I work with that would be helpful, I love. But I also would imagine that different people who are, you know, cisgendered, that if it were, the language were more inclusive, that they might feel more comfortable to do more switching.
Yeah, I even just last night I had a friend say to me, I wish I could follow because I find leading really hard, and I think it would be nice if I could learn to follow. But he is unlikely to take that role because it's, you know, there's that perception of, well, who's gonna dance with me then? Sometimes that exists in his own space, whether that's the public perception or not. You know, we each carry with us our own sort of barriers to making those switches.
Dan, I just wanted to say thank you for the amazing presentation. You really sort of tackled a lot of different parts of kind of gender and thinking about kind of trans community, and I just wanted to say thanks first of all, and I really appreciated your words. I think the conversation about language is always something that we're going to have to come back to, and thanks Kazel for digging in and asking more about this. I think that's really important. I liked what you both said about sort of setting the scene and the kind of teachers or workshop facilitators or event organizers role in that. And, you know, I guess at a workshop, you can sort of have everyone together and you have the opportunity to do more of a formal introduction, and you can do the same if you're teaching regular classes. And your point, Diana, that it doesn't have to be just when it's for the trans or LGBT community, that there needs to be this conversation, but can be everywhere. And I thought that was really great. So thank you for that. I had a kind of question that's sort of been going around my head. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase it, but I've been looking a bit at like what other dance communities overseas do in terms of trans inclusion and LGBT inclusion as well. And it seems like there's a lot of different discourse about how different teachers and schools deal with gender. So, I mean, some of them, everything is gender neutral, all of the names, all the roles, and others, they've sort of conceptualized gender as more of an archetype or something you can choose to embody in that space, and treating it more as a concept rather than something that's kind of fixed about you. Or for example, you could do what might be seen as feminine movements in a dance, but that doesn't mean that you as an individual are feminine or identify as female, sorry, or it doesn't mean that you do feminine movements outside of the dance space. So I was just curious to hear about what you think in terms of the space for gender expression, and I don't know, like for the trans community, whether it's, especially if you identify as, for example, if you identify as female, whether you would feel weird to be put in a role which might have masculine connotations from the history of the dance. Yeah, I don't know if I'm phrasing that right because it's kind of working around in my head. So
I think that it has to do with the safety of the environment and the individuals there. That, you know, some people, particularly, I'm thinking of I can only speak from my experience, and you know, we see a lot of young people, and we see a lot of young people really playing with these different archetypes and these different aspects, and experiencing and expressing their gender in on different layers and levels that can vary greatly, you know, from week to week. And just having a really just kind of safe and accepting place where that is just normalized, you know, like bring as you are, come as you are, and however you're expressing today, that just literally being very, I mean, what I love, it can be very mindful. I mean, as a psychologist, it's all about mindfulness and bringing it into the present, and, you know, like letting the other stuff outside, creating a separate space. And, but there, of course, will be people, I mean, we all are more or less comfortable expressing different aspects of ourselves, including our gender, in different environments, you know, due to just a variety of factors. So it's really impossible to, I think, I don't see a way to standardize the perfect environment. It just needs to be like, interesting you bring up schools. We work with a lot of schools. Like right now, Tauranga Girls College, which has historically been a girls' school, is actually one of our most inclusive schools. With they've got a bunch of trans girls have now enrolled. They've got a lot of non-binary and you know, female-bodied students that are identifying as trans-masculine, and it's just not a problem. They're changing their language and their you know, all of their documentation and their signs and their bathroom construction and changing rooms. But when I go to schools, I have another slide somewhere that's like level 1, where it's like, okay, some minor accommodations have been made for one person in a specific instance, but it's still like, you know, very much cisgender normative, you know. Then stage 2 would be like, okay, so accommodations have been made to incorporate for a particular group of people for a particular period of time, right? Stage 3 would be like, okay, accommodations have been, you know, like incorporated, but are not fully, you know, utilized or in all aspects. And then stage 4 would be, you know, just like a complete normalization of, hey, this is gender and how we express it in this dance. It's funny. So I went to see the Czech ballet in Tauranga last night, because you don't get ballet a lot. And I thought, oh, the Czech, and really looking at the gendered roles, so gendered in so many ways. And one of the things, you know, the lead male was a spectacular dancer, as was the lead female, but there was no chemistry between them, because it was like the lead male was so obviously gay. And just thinking about the centuries really of gender expression, and that's very rigid rules of ballet, as opposed to my understanding of Zouk, which is kind of putting all of that on its head, even though technically I guess ballet did emerge from the streets of Paris as a revolutionary dance form.
I might just make some comments as a dance participant, and it might partly answer Elizabeth's question that she posed. And I guess to do that, I'll just give a little history, because I'd also like some feedback from the Zouk people, because I haven't danced Zouk. I originally danced pre my transition, so I was dancing as a lead in ballroom and Latin. And ballroom and Latin is pretty staid, that men lead, women follow. So after my transition, because I like dancing, I went back, in fact, to the same dance school and learnt to dance as a follow, as a female, which was okay, but it didn't totally grab me, and there wasn't a lot of social opportunity to use it. So I went and took up Sarok, which is loosely related to Zouk. They're not the same, but they have some similar, watching your videos, there's definitely some similarities. That is very much predicated around lead and follow. The language in the lessons is lead and follow, although nearly all the leads are male and nearly all the follows are female, but it isn't strictly enforced. And as I got better, there was nearly always a mismatch between the number of males and the number of females, as you get in most dance schools, I would suspect. And so a lot of the more experienced females in the learner classes would dance lead. I somewhat resisted that for a while because it wasn't something I felt comfortable with, but eventually I did because they were short and I'd been dancing at that stage for 3 years and I was quite experienced. And actually it was really great. One, I guess I'd had the experience, but if you've been following, you become a much better lead because you know what the followers need. And I actually think all leads should be made to follow a little bit because they become better leads. So I'm interested in the comments from the Zouk people, but that was certainly my personal experience. And Gina, as a comment, the only bad experiences I had is there were 1 or 2 people at one of the classes who would refuse to dance with me. And in Sarok, you go around in a circle, you do a move, you move around. And there are a couple of men that would just walk away when I came along and would not dance with me. And one of those continued, and so I just ignored them as well and thought, well, you're missing out, I'm a good dancer, you know, so be it. But other than that, everyone else, you know, that would be 1 out of 20 people in the class. The other 19 were fine around it, and I would get asked sometimes at the social dancers to dance once people knew I was a good dancer. So it was just some general comments from the other side of it. But I think for a lot of trans people there is, I know when I transitioned, I kind of gave away a whole lot of things I did because they didn't feel they fitted my new role. And a lot of them I've now come back to because it's like women can do anything. So it doesn't matter. You know, if you're interested in car racing and rallying, you shouldn't not do that because you're female. And so on. So anyway, that's my little 2 cents worth.
Kathy, thanks so much for sharing your story. That was wonderful. It's really great to hear about your experience. And I feel like some of what you said echoed my own experience with leading and following. I think at the beginning as well, I started to learn to lead because I felt the classes were very lead orientated, and I was like, no, I want the same information and I want to learn as much as everybody else. And at the beginning, some women wouldn't dance with me because they saw that as like, I don't know, me trying to come on to them just because of my gender or something like this. So it was quite uncomfortable. And then I got better at dancing. And those same women that were initially uncomfortable were asked me to dance. So it was kind of an interesting experience. That wasn't in Zouk, that was in Kizomba in a different dance, but I found that was what I experienced in Australia mostly. And then when I went to Brazil, I thought there would be a lot more stigma around who's leading and who's following because some of the gender roles are very hyper-gendered in Brazil. But actually I found so many women were leading and so many men were following, and so many people, there was a lot of non-binary dancers who had traveled from US and different parts that were learning both roles, which was awesome. And I just found it was an environment that was very accepting. So yeah, I don't know. I think every dance thing's going to be a little bit different depending on the culture it's embedded in. It's sort of sometimes, you know, the dance community is part of all the other communities, and sometimes they reflect some things that are going on that are problematic. But I also feel like dance is also a space of inclusion and a space where people get challenged about things. And I think, yeah, I'm happy to hear that you were able to find a lot of people that wanted to dance and that you got to be able to express yourself in that space. It's very cool.
I was also say Sarok I didn't compete, but at the competition level they do have same-sex competitions, which are not for the LGBT community. It's just for the dancers, and all of the instructors obviously have to learn to do both lead and follow, and so you quite often do see those kind of competitions, whether it be female pairs and male pairs. who are mostly straight people just doing the dance, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is that it's all going to depend on the individual. When we're running a workshop, for example, and we're teaching about fluid traveling between the roles, not everyone's going to feel comfortable switching between the roles. There might be some people who will say, I'm here because I'm this gender and I want to stay this gender, you know, in that kind of like the role assigned there. And so it's up to us to make it like a really safe space to want to play, but also be really respectful that some people will not want to, you know, will say this is, I'm going to go with a sort of a traditional route in that way too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my thing is whenever going into an area where there's less experience, is just to go gently, and to go with kindness and to go with communication. That, you know, that as your role as a dance teacher is also a group facilitator, where you are setting the tone of the workshop. Like, you know, is it that you know, I would encourage starting with, you know, your own name, identified pronouns, and the role that, you know, you want to work, you know, that you want to dance, and what that might mean. And, you know, then people will follow from there. I mean, so, and then as you do this and you get more information, you will see, you know, it will adapt. Like, so I think like after one workshop, the next workshop will just naturally kind of feed into that, or ways to like incorporate a more gender diverse, inclusive space into classes in general. Then that step will be more obvious.
Yeah, I think using lead and follow and they and them rather than male, female, he, she goes 80% of the way there at least. And I mean, that is fairly natural, I think, with this style of dancing. Certainly the lead and follow is the common terminology anyway, but it's then remembering to take out the he does this and she does that part of it, and that probably allows the people in the class to be more fluid, and anybody not feel cut out from either of those roles.
I agree, like that 80%. It seems like it's really low-hanging fruit, like it's one of the easiest things to do. And yet even I, who've been really kind of promoting this as a thing, I found myself in a conversation in a social setting just the other night referring to leads as he. And even though I was leading, and I was like, oh man, it does get in. Like it's really tricky to make it a habit, but the more people do it and the more we're aware of it, I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of, I guess there's that anxiety about, is we're not going to be perfect. Even like doing this upskilling, learning how to be more inclusive, there's going to be mistakes in our language while we're teaching, while we're conducting the class. It's inevitable. And I think that's like it's awful, because I think, oh no, I'm going to hurt somebody just by misgendering them. But we just have to, like you say, Diana, just sorry, I made a mistake, and just go on with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's like, the thing is you're putting attention into this space, into developing an awareness of things. I say, you know, before anything can be consciously changed, it has to be brought into consciousness. And one of the difficulties that we have with, you know, gendered roles is that we take them as truth rather than deeply embedded, you know, social norms. Because as soon as you start to take them all up, I mean, it makes perfect sense. They, them, you know, because if you're also, especially if you're teaching a class, like, so there are lots of them, even if people struggle with the singular, you know, the lead does this and then they do this, the lead does this, you know, that makes, it flows. But you have to bring it into consciousness. You have to continue to nurture it. And then it takes on, a life of its own and becomes much more natural. Yes, absolutely. You're going to make mistakes. We make mistakes. And I'm constantly like, okay. But I'm using the person's name. And I think I know that I've actually talked to a number of people who have expressed that they avoid certain situations because they're afraid of misgendering people and they don't want to upset anybody. And while, like, on one hand, I love that they're sensitive and thinking about that, it always kind of makes me sad because I feel like everyone misses out then. When people honestly see you making an effort, that is the biggest thing. To be fair, I know I know and work with some people where any misgendering is really perceived as hurtful, but it's actually rare that people will take it that personally if they see you making an effort. Very rare. It's more common that people are like, oh well, it sucks, I don't like it, but moving on because they have to deal with this so much in their life. But as a person, if you just start referring to whoever you're in the room with as a neutral pronoun, and using people's names more, and just being more aware of it, because then it just naturally, if you lead with that, it just naturally follows.
Beautiful. And I'm just really conscious of the time now. Should we just agree to wrap this up? I'm pretty sure this conversation can go on indefinitely, because it is. I mean, it's so fascinating, and there's so much more that we can discuss. So if we just have like a last few closing thoughts, and then we'll cut this off at 3, and I wanted to ask everybody's permission as well, to make this video available to other dance teachers in the community who couldn't be here tonight. Just checking in that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Lovely. All right, well, thank you. And all right, so any final thoughts? Anyone who hasn't spoken who wants to say something?
Yeah, I guess the thing which is probably most on my mind is like Zouk compared to a bunch of other dances is quite a close, and I don't know, maybe sensual. I don't know if that's quite the right term, but just wondering, is this that likely to be quite confronting for the group of students that we're likely to be teaching?
I would imagine that people who are signing up for this, it would only attract people who are aware that it is going to require some element of self, being seen by others, being potentially touching and moving. So I doubt that, but with anything, I'm assuming that consent is part of the whole process. And that people who, if for some reason feel triggered or uncomfortable, they can step back. And we are dealing with this adults, so the assumption is that someone participating would be at the point that they're able to self-manage in that circumstance.
I can say that when you get people together to come together as a couple to dance, that point of coming together, you are inviting. Usually the lead invites the follow to come together, and the follow will determine how close they want to come, and then you stick with that, and that's how you dance together. That's how people have been taught to do that. So
that sounds lovely.
It really is. I mean, if I can just share anything, it's that Zouk is really lovely.
Well, thank you, Kazel, for arranging all of this. If there's anything more that I can do to help support, and my understanding is that things have just gotten really kind of hectic for everybody, so we're looking at now moving the workshop more towards March or April.
Yeah, I think it looks like Elizabeth's dropped off, and so that would be a conversation between the 3 of us to really figure out some different dates and ways to make it work. Maybe we don't have time today because it looks like Elizabeth's literally moving house. So if we park that and use the emails to try and plan what comes next. But I'm so grateful to everybody that came today, and to those that weren't able to make it. We've got people literally teaching Zouk in Brisbane today. Others are traveling in France. Like, it's a really exciting borders open kind of a world there. So but there's plenty of people who are interested in looking at the video. So if you're watching this on the video, like, hello and thank you for joining us that way as well.
Totally off the topic question, but is there a Zouk class in Tauranga?
Yeah, there are. There are actually 2 classes that get taught. There's a Monday night class and another one that will be on a Tuesday with a different teacher. The Tuesday class is going to be starting with a new beginners block in January or February. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted to have the event kind of early on, so that there would be like a natural pathway into a beginners class. But it might not work out that way if we postpone it. But you know, that's not necessarily the only goal either of having the workshop with the gender dynamics community, because it's really about just, I don't know, just bringing that gift of the joyfulness of it. And you can pick it up pretty much at any time. Usually you can just join the classes. The Monday night classes, they just run. The beginners are just welcomed in.
Thanks.
Sounds fun. Well, thank you all so much. Enjoy your beautiful Sunday afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Diane. I really appreciate it. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
All right. Cheers.